Well, it's good to be with you this evening. The musical number made me remember the South African connections we have in America. Actually, the Dallas Suzuki Institute, which trains a lot of young people in Texas in regards to good music. Both of the leaders of the Suzuki Institute actually come from here in South Africa. The teacher Solomon has taught both of my older boys violin and viola. There's a piano and organ teacher there that also teaches music theory. His name is Karl von Veek. They told us a few things. This is our first time in South Africa, but they told us a few things about it. And they have an ear for good music. They get very good teachers. They have a number of teachers there, but one of the teachers teaches my youngest son, who is here on the camp piano. And that piano teacher normally takes his students to the point where they get 4-year scholarships, tuition paid, as well as room and board paid at all of the top 5 music schools in America. Juilliard School and Eastman School of Music, and those. He's an exceptional piano teacher that these South African folk somehow found in America to line up with them and teach there at the Dallas Suzuki Music Institute. For those who weren't, how many were there at the 10 o'clock meeting this morning? Okay, so we have a number of hands that have gone up. For those of you that were not there, you may want to get the tape in regards to music and intelligence. There's also some things in regards to emotional intelligence there that are worthwhile as well. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about not what we put into our body, not so much what we do with our body, but actually how we think. And this has to do with in the area of emotional intelligence. And if we are going to be effective, we do need to be able to enhance particularly the frontal lobe of our brain in regards to how we think. Now, I don't have a computer up here to look. Actually, I think there may be a screen to look at things, but I have a remote that is only supposed to work from 30 feet away. But it's actually 50 feet, so we might need some extra power here tonight for this remote to work, but we'll see how it works. Emotional intelligence is something that actually has more to do with your success and happiness in life than even your IQ. We talked about how important IQ is the last 2 presentations I gave. But EQ is actually more acquainted, actually more related to success. For instance, studies show that the job you get out of college is related to your IQ. How far you advance in that job is no longer related to your IQ. It's actually related to your emotional intelligence. And this is why some people are confused. Yeah, some people are Ivy League scholars. They've gotten great jobs, but then they're being passed up by others of lesser intelligence in the workplace, in the promotion area. And I'll ask them, what do you think is going on? And they'll say, I don't think my boss has enough intelligence to recognize my intelligence, and thus I'm being passed over by promotion. And actually the boss is recognizing intelligence, but he's recognizing emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence actually is something that is more easily learned than even how to enhance your IQ. It's something that will take people, for instance, it was mentioned that we treat depression and anxiety at Weimar, which we do. But we will have people go through a 10-day residential program, severe depression and anxiety. We measure their emotional intelligence on intake. And when they leave, 10 days later, not only do they leave in most cases, depression-free and anxiety-free, but their emotional intelligence normally is in the top 25 percentile of the nation. That means that they will actually be more successful from that point forward than people who've never suffered from mental illness on average, because emotional intelligence is that important in regards to future success. There are 5 components of emotional intelligence. The first component is knowing our emotions. That means we need to have the ability to be able to completely understand what we're feeling and also why we are feeling that way. Some people call it self-awareness, and that is something that is important. Secondly, managing our emotions. Now, people that have low emotional intelligence will still have a lot of emotions, but they will be managed by those emotions. Day by day, moment by moment, they're being managed by their emotions. People with high emotional intelligence also have emotions, sometimes powerful emotions, but they are managing those emotions, distinctly different. And managing emotions has a lot to do with something called self-control. And studies are now showing people with high self-control live a psychological good life. They're far better in regards to happiness and success than people with low self-control. And so this is a critical element in regards to being able to control oneself. Recognizing emotions in others is also part of emotional intelligence. In order to do that well, we need to be interested in others. We also need to have empathy. The fourth factor is managing relationships with others. Sometimes that's called social intelligence, and you can see why our joy and happiness in life has a lot to do with our relationships, and so you can see why emotional intelligence is so important in regards to happiness because of its relationship to relationships. And then the fifth aspect is motivating ourselves to achieve our goals. In the middle of the word emotion, in fact, most of the word emotion actually is a word motion. Emotions that were based on things that were true and accurate were meant to powerfully motivate us to achieve our goals. Short-term goals, but especially long-term goals as well. Well, increasing emotional intelligence in the medical literature has been shown to help effectively prevent or treat depression, phobias, obsessive-compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anorexia, bulimia, and even addictions such as alcoholism. There's a program that is now worldwide. You probably have it here in South Africa because I've noticed today I was looking at your South African statistics as far as causes of death and disability and things of that nature. And alcohol is up there in one of the leading causes of death in this country. And so I know you have a 12-step program here called Alcoholics Anonymous. Has anyone heard of that? Okay. Studies show that the 12-step program does have some success in being able to overcome an addiction such as alcohol. But if you combine it with a program that improves emotional intelligence, you will increase that success fourfold. A dramatic increase in success in overcoming addictions. And sometimes in America, the one who came up with the 12-step program is called Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob teaches in the 12-step program that your worst year of your life is going to be your first year of sobriety. But actually, it doesn't need to be that way. He tells you the reason why that's the case is because you will get into what's called stinking thinking. But if you have a program that improves emotional intelligence, you won't have any stinking thinking. And as a result, you are far less likely to go back into alcohol. And so, that is also true for other addictions as well. So emotional intelligence helps a lot of people with disease conditions. Fortunately, it also helps people that are classified as mentally healthy or normal people. And I assume in a group this size, we have some of you represented in that particular group. An increase in emotional intelligence actually helps people to think clearer, to communicate more effectively, to foster unity in group settings. It actually reduces polarizing statements. It promotes a happier life. But all of this is accomplished without compromise or sacrificing the truth. A lot of people think the only way you can have unity is to put differences aside. And that will produce a superficial unity that will not withstand stress coming into the situation. The only way to have bedrock unity that can withstand stress is if that unity is based upon what is true. And so emotional intelligence does not sacrifice truth. Truth is very important to those with high emotional intelligence. Accuracy, and particularly accuracy in the way they are thinking personally. Now, there are many influences on emotional intelligence. Our genetic makeup has a role to play in our emotional intelligence. Our childhood experiences have a role to play in our emotional intelligence. The current level of emotional support that you're having has a role to play. And then there are physical conditions. If you're lacking in sleep for 48 hours, what do you think happens to your emotional intelligence? Does it go up or does it go down? It actually does go down. If you're lacking in good nutrition, the emotional intelligence will go down considerably. Illness can also bring the emotional intelligence down. And all of those factors are important. But studies show that for many, there is something far more important than those things. In fact, psychologists are now agreeing that these are the most important factors related to emotional intelligence. The major influence on emotional intelligence is that our emotions are largely controlled by our what? Beliefs, our evaluation of events, the way we think about problems, and our silent self-talk. That's the moment-by-moment thoughts or messages we are giving ourselves. Now, it turns out that the feelings that you have are actually from the messages you give yourself. And this is something that a lot of people have a little misunderstanding about. They think their feelings are strictly due to what others are doing to them, how others are treating them, the things that have happened to them. And yes, those things have a role to play, but not near as important a role as the messages they are actually giving themselves. Your thoughts have much more to do with how you're feeling than what is actually happening in your life. Let me give you an example. Paul and Silas, they were taken against their will. They were beaten 39 times with the cat o' nine tails. And why were they not beaten 40 times? It would have killed them. And so that's the torture that they underwent. And then they were not put on a nice grass floor like this. They were actually put on an irregular dirt floor with rocks. Their feet were put up in stocks. And there they were, crying uncontrollably in prison and saying, "Why us, Lord?" Actually, the first part of the story is true, but some of you recognize that the second part wasn't true. They actually had happy looks on their faces, and they were singing praises to God. Why is that the case? Because their thoughts had much more to do with how they were feeling than what was actually happening in their life. Now, if the thoughts can do that, and by the way, this isn't pop psychology. Pop psychology would have taught Paul and Silas to imagine that they're on a nice beach in Mozambique. That would have worked for no more than 1.2 seconds. The reminders of where they were at would have caught up with them, and their emotions would have turned sour again. But they weren't thinking fantasy thoughts. They were thinking true and accurate thoughts, but those true and accurate thoughts were so powerful that even under those type of adverse circumstances, they could have a happy look on their face and sing praises to God. Now, I'm going to go over 3 emotional intelligence stories, and these are 3 stories that you can refer to later on because they are ancient stories. and they're all different characters, but yet they can teach us some things. The first story comes from the Bible, and it tells us of a man who was tall. Now, is there an advantage for a man to be tall? There are some advantages for a man being tall. At least in America, since 1900, the tallest man has won the presidential race every time except for 2 times. And you thought the last presidential election was about race? It wasn't about race. It was about height, and the tallest man won again. Now, this man was head and shoulders tall, and so when he walked by, people looked. In addition, the Bible tells us that he was handsome. Not just handsome, the term in Hebrew is that he was of stunning appearance. And so not only did people look because he was tall when he walked by, but he just had this easy on the eye appeal. In addition, he was wealthy. Now, I know some single girls are thinking if I could find a man with just 1 or 2 of those things, I'd be okay. But to find a man with 3 would be very unusual. But nonetheless, he came from a wealthy home and he had a lot of money. But then he had a 4th attribute that often people with the first 3 don't have. And that is, he was well liked by people who knew him as well as the general public. Now, I went to medical school at Loma Linda University, and I did a lot of rotations in Los Angeles, right close to Hollywood. And so we would treat a lot of these Hollywood stars when they became sick. And I can tell you, although many of them are good looking and wealthy, they are well liked usually only by people who don't know them. There's a reason why they go through 7 divorces by the time they're age 40. And it's not because they're well-liked individuals. They're not high on the emotional intelligence scale. They have the IQ to memorize their lines and to act like somebody else, but they're actually sometimes some of the most despicable human beings to be around. But this man wasn't this way. He had a humility about him. He didn't have a pride and arrogancy. In fact, in addition to that, the Bible tells us that the Lord anointed him to be the first king over God's chosen people, Israel. This was a man who was so humble that he was even hiding in the baggage when it was time for his coronation. He didn't really want to be up front and to make a big scene. And his advisors, who were worried because he came from a small tribe, the biggest tribe in Israel felt slighted. They felt like the king should have come from their tribe. And so there were those who actually conspired against him in the process of becoming king. And Saul was told, you better get rid of those people. Put them in jail or kill them because they're going to cause you trouble. As soon as things start going wrong with your kingdom, they're going to be the first ones out of the gate to complain about you and stir up the people against you. But Saul said, no, let's leave them alone. No problem. We're just going to go forward and give them no punishment whatsoever. He did some courageous acts when he became king. He actually defended a border of Israel that most kings would not have defended. He went out of his way to do a number of good things, and Saul had a lot going for him. But after a couple of years, it became clear that emotional problems began to surface. And research has documented that negative thoughts, which cause emotional turmoil, nearly always contain gross distortions. I think that bears repeating. Research has documented that negative thoughts, which cause emotional turmoil, nearly always contain what? Gross distortions. In other words, the thoughts on the surface appear valid, but you will learn that they are irrational or just plain wrong, and that twisted thinking is a major cause of suffering. What's a major cause of suffering? Twisted thinking. So let's take a look at some of the thoughts that Saul had and what could have led to his mental illness. Now, there are 10 actually categories of ways in which we can think distorted thoughts. I'm giving you 3 illustrations here tonight, so we're only going to cover 3 out of those 10. But if you're interested in covering all 10 of those and how to correct that, there is a book over at the ABC that we wrote called The Lost Art of Thinking that can give you a lot more food for thought and study there. But we will cover 3 big ones. Magnification and minimization. This means that we major in minors and we minor in majors. And when Saul was confronted with something that he did wrong, instead of his owning up to it, taking responsibility for it, he minimized it and acted like it was no big deal. And you know, whenever we're confronted with something that we've done wrong, how we respond to that has a lot to do whether we're going to grow in emotional intelligence or whether we are going to plummet as far as emotional intelligence is concerned. Now, even Confucius said years ago, a man who has committed a mistake and doesn't correct it is doing what? Committing another mistake. And that another mistake is even worse often than the first mistake, because they have the opportunity to correct it, but instead they're not. And so they are going to bear repeating of the first mistake and have that ingrained in him. And unfortunately, that's what Saul did. David Schwartz says, we can turn setbacks into victories, find the lesson, apply it, and move on, then look back on defeat and smile. And so that's one of the advantages of living a Christian life is the process of repentance and forgiveness. But you know, we can't move forward in our emotional intelligence if we don't take responsibility for the wrongs that we have done. And if we don't actually not only take responsibility for them, confess them, and have a commitment to not go back to them and put up barriers in doing so. This is one of the processes that can significantly improve our emotional intelligence over time. Now, the other thing that Saul began to do as a result, by the way, if you remember the story, Samuel came to him and said, how come you didn't do all that the Lord had asked? And Saul, being a good debater, said, well, I did most of the things the Lord asks, and why are you just pointing out, with all the things I've done that the Lord has asked, why are you focusing in on just the 1 or 2 things that I didn't do right? And Samuel and him went back and forth, and when it was clear that Saul was totally minimizing his mistake, then Samuel issued the judgment. And at that point, Saul, when he realized there was a judgment, began to own up to his mistake. And in reality, he wasn't really repenting. He was just trying to avoid the consequences of the mistake. Now, the consequences were issued by who? Actually, it wasn't issued by Samuel. It was issued by God. Is God a just God? He is a just God. So the punishment actually fit the crime. But Saul did not think so. He thought the punishment far outweighed the crime. And what I've noticed is this. If you live long enough, you're actually going to be treated unfairly at times in life. There's no way that a person can live an entire life without being treated significantly unfairly at times. And so we actually need to be surprised and pleased when we're treated fairly. But nonetheless, often those who dwell on the unfairness of their life actually have been treated rather fairly. And Saul was the one who continued to dwell on the unfairness of life. We call that a nonsense argument. You know, if only this didn't happen, then this wouldn't have happened. And so we keep going back to the if only when there's nothing at that point that we can do about it except to try to grow from it. And so we end up with not just the practical problem, we end up with a bigger problem, the emotional problem, that ends up making the situation tenfold worse than what the practical problem would have been. But Saul began to continue to dwell on the unfairness of his life at that point. And it began to make him even more emotionally distraught. Then, this one is not so intuitive. People that suffer mental illness, one of the hallmarks of major depression that is getting severe, is when people start to have feelings of worthlessness. Feelings of worthlessness actually always start first with feelings of egotism and pride. You have an inflated sense of pride, then your pride is wounded, and then you end up having feelings of worthlessness. And so in reality, he was using magnification and minimization in all three of these. In this case, he was magnifying himself. He had a high self-esteem that was wounded by the people, and especially the women's obvious preference for another leader. Now, this was a man who had been very humble at first. But you know, there's something in general that happens when people obtain power if they don't watch out. Have you heard the statement, power corrupts? And absolute power corrupts absolutely? That's just one of those human nature aspects of things. And so even though he started out very humble, he developed a sense of egotism. And when people tell you how great you are, and every time they see you say, live forever, it can start getting into your head that you actually think you are some sort of great individual. And Saul and his whole army were coming back after a great victory. This was a tremendous victory over the Philistines. And the women were lined up in Jerusalem to invite their soldiers, their husbands, their fathers, many of them young women between the ages of 15 and 25. And this was